Let's talk some chess. This game took place in 1964 in Utah. Bobby Fischer playing with the white pieces and someone named Ted Hartwell with the black pieces. Unfortunately, couldn't find a picture of Mr. Hartwell. This was in a simul, or simultaneous exhibition. Essentially, that means Bobby's playing against many different people at the same time, trying to make it even by distracting Bobby with a bunch of different boards, and we'll see if that works for Ted Hartwell. So Bobby opens up with e4. We have c5, the Sicilian defense by Ted Hartwell, knight to f3, knight to c6 by Ted, and d4 by Bobby. So the open Sicilian, very common opening, still played in games today. Pawn captures on d4, knight captures on d4, and now instead of taking back with the knight and allowing the queen to come to d4, which is a nice central square for the queen, instead knight to f6, developing another piece and adding an attacker to this pawn on e4, which is currently undefended. Bobby defends it with knight to b3, so developing a piece and protecting this pawn on e4. And now g6 by Ted, preparing to fianchetto the dark squared bishop on g7. Bishop to e3 by Bobby, bishop fianchettoed by Ted on g7, and now bishop to c4. Just in case Ted wants to castle kingside, which, spoiler alert, he will soon. This light squared bishop is an excellent attacker. It will be pinning the f7 pawn and will be very useful as Bobby tries to get an attack against the enemy king. d6 here by Ted, preparing a lane for his light squared bishop to develop. f3 by Bobby, and now kingside castle by Ted Hartwell. We have queen to d2 by Bobby, developing the queen off the back rank, aligning it with the bishop. Maybe the bishop wants to trade the other dark squared bishop on h6, but most importantly allowing Bobby to castle queenside and then push his pawns and get an attack going against the enemy king. So a6 here, preparing potentially ideas of b5 to sort of harry this bishop away from the c4 square. Bobby for the moment ignores it and just castles queenside. And now Ted puts the knight on e5. So knight to e5, and this is quite a nice square for the knight. It's attacking the undefended bishop on c4 and just generally controlling a lot of important squares in Bobby's position. So Bobby retreats the bishop out of harm's way, away from the knight, and still maintaining this excellent diagonal, pinning the f7 pawn to the enemy king. But now b5 by Ted, and starting to get some pressure on the queen side here, marching these pawns forward and trying to get an attack against Bobby's king. This is a very common type of game where one side castles queenside, the other side castles kingside, and because essentially here, because Bobby doesn't have his king castled kingside on g1, he can afford to push these pawns and get an attack going. And just the same with Ted Hartwell, there's no king castled here on c8, so the pawns can just move forward and get after Bobby's king. So here, speak of the devil, Bobby plays h4, pushing his pawns to get after this enemy king, and now h5, locking up this h-file and not allowing this pawn to advance any further. But Bobby wants to advance further, so he plays g4, attacking this pawn on h5, and here Ted trades, h takes on g4, and now f4 by Bobby, wanting to push further and potentially break up this pawn structure, creating a passed pawn here on the g-file, but Bobby's not too worried about this. He'll easily be able to capture if this pawn starts to march forward to the promotion square on g1. Knight to f3 here by Ted. This comes with an attack on the queen on d2, so Bobby just captures, knight takes on f3, pawn takes on f3, and now f5 by Bobby. And this was the kind of critical moment in the game. You can sort of see in this position, Bobby really has everything going on. He has a semi-open h-file, a semi-open g-file. The rook is ready to come into the game. The bishop and the queen are ready to open up a battery on this diagonal. The light squared bishop is pinning the pawn to the king. Bobby's king is very safe here on c1. The three pawns are still in front of it. Ted's king is not as safe. There's no h-pawn anymore. Bobby has everything in this position. But he needs to play the correct move here to keep the advantage. And usually Bobby Fischer does play the correct move, but here he does not. He plays f5, and the problem with this move, we'll see the problem with this move in a moment, but the problem with this move is it allows Ted to get this b4 move in, attacking the pawn on c3. And we'll explain, what this means in a moment, but just believe me when I say, we'll talk about it in a second, Bobby went from having a huge advantage in this position, and now the advantage is all Ted's, and we'll sort of see things start to fall apart for Bobby as we move the pieces a bit more. So here, knight to d5, getting away from this pawn, which is obviously attacking the knight. But now, knight takes on e4. And this is a surprisingly weak pawn. This was sort of Ted's idea. This pawn on e4 is only defended by the knight on c3, but now that Ted's pawn is attacking the knight, forcing the knight to vacate the defense of the pawn, now you can just take with the knight, and now this is a great knight. It's attacking the queen on d2. There's no more white pawn on e4, and there's a passed pawn here for Ted on f3, so a nice little combination. Queen to h2, getting the queen out of harm's way and lining up with the rook on the h-file, but the problem here is that you're hemmed in by the h4 pawn. And I think now's a good time to sort of go back and see what the correct move for Bobby was in this situation. It's a very similar idea. You want to push your pawns, you want to get an attack going, but instead, in this position, instead of playing f5, the correct move here is to play h5. And there's a couple reasons behind this move. Let's sort of see what happens if Ted tries the sort of same thing. So b4 attacking the knight here on c4, knight moves to d5, knight captures, but now we get bishop captures on d5, and now after bishop to e6 challenging the bishop, now we get this h takes on g6, opening up the g file. And this is what's really important here. There's a couple of important things, but because the pawn is on h5 instead of f5, of course, you can take with the h5 pawn, which opens up the h-file for the rook and the queen. So when we go back to the main line, you'll see how the line that was actually played in the game, you'll see how the rook and the queen are on the h-file, but they're blocked by an h-pawn. But in this position, Bobby can capture and open up the h-file, which allows him to get after an attack. So after the bishops trade off, queen takes on d5, and this is the other reason why you don't want to have a pawn on f5. Now the queen can swing over to h5, not unblocked by this pawn on f5, and again, as I mentioned before, the h-file is open because you got this h5 pawn move in, and we're able to capture with the h-pawn on g6. So now after e6, queen to h5, and this is just a very scary attack and going to be very difficult to stop, and that's the sort of the idea behind this h5 move. So hopefully that made sense. Again, two reasons you want to play h5 instead of f5. One is that you eventually want to open up the h-file for your rook and your queen, and two, you don't want a pawn on f5 blocking the queen once the queen eventually comes to d5. Bobby unfortunately didn't see it. I'm sure if this was the only game he was playing, he would have saw it, but it's a simultaneous exhibition, as we said, so we can't fault him too much. Plays f5, and then we showed these moves before. Now you have the queen and the rook on the h-file, but the queen and the rook are blocked by a pawn on h4, and of course it's your own pawn, you can't capture it, so very hard to get an attack going this way. So much less worse for Bobby in this position. And now Ted can sort of continue with this. Now he's on the attack. He plays bishop captures on f5, and now these two pawns of Bobby's have been replaced by Ted's pieces, a very powerful bishop and knight, and now all of a sudden Bobby is on the defensive. So here he plays h5. Finally, this was the move he had to play from the start, trying to open up the h-file, but of course Ted does not want to open up the h-file and just closes it with g5, and now it's going to be very difficult for the queen and the rook to get out from behind this h-pawn. h6 now by Bobby, just keep marching on, but now the bishop can just happily come to e4, and now this bishop is incredibly solid on e4. It can't be pushed away by one of Bobby's pawns. It's attacking the queen on h2, so it comes to the square with tempo, and of course it's protected by the pawn on d6. So a completely super solid bishop. The queen here moves to h5, and this looks very threatening, but there's really not much you can do here. The pawn and the bishops are doing a good job protecting the king. And here in this case, bishop to g6 by Ted, solidifying the bishop by adding a pawn to protect it, and just sort of kicking the queen away from this h5 square. Bobby plays a nice intermezzo here. Knight takes on e7 with check, so this looks like a knight sacrifice because the knight can be taken by the queen. But after the queen takes, then Bobby plays what looks like a shocking move, but it's not a shocking move. Queen takes on g6 with check. It looks like this is a queen sacrifice, but it's not, because don't forget about this bishop on b3, pinning this f7 pawn to the king. And this looks like sort of a dire attack to deal with, but it's not. There's only one move that makes sense here. It's king to h8, but now all of a sudden the attack is essentially over. The queen can't deliver checkmate and team up with the pawn on g7 because the dark squared bishop on e5 is protecting that square. So as exciting as this attack looks, it's petered out, and Bobby doesn't have the momentum that he was hoping for. So queen to h5, sort of retreating here. now obviously the pawn is threatening to capture the queen because the pawn is no longer pinned, so Bobby has to retreat the queen. And now knight to g3 by Ted, a wonderful forking the queen and the rook here, so winning material. Queen captures on f3, getting out of the fork, and knight takes on h1. We have rook takes on h1, and now if we do a quick material check, we can see that Ted is up the exchange, and he's up one pawn as well. And these aren't, these are both pass pawns. This is obviously a nice pawn for Bobby, but these are both pass pawns, and just a big material advantage for Ted Hartwell. And here he plays f5, just pushing these pawns, and nothing can stop these pass pawns, and Bobby's pieces have to worry about getting trapped in this pawn storm. So Bobby plays bishop to d2, queen to f6, now adding an attacker to this h6 pawn, which is defended by the rook, so we won't take it just yet, but just keeping an eye on it. More importantly, setting up a battery of the queen and the bishop on this b2 pawn. Bobby takes the pawn with the bishop on b4, and now we have bishop takes on b2 with check. King moves to b1, bishop retreats back to e5, rook to g1 by Bobby, trying to get in front of these pass pawns, sacrificing his own pass pawn on h6. This isn't a serious sacrifice, because if Hartwell takes this pawn, then you just get rook to h1, pinning the queen to the king, and the queen can't take back because then the white queen is actually protecting the h1 square. So Hartwell doesn't fall for this trap, instead just plays rook to c8, getting the rook on the semi-open file, now attacking this c2 pawn, and now bishop to d2. Bobby just sort of playing the waiting game here. Adding a second attacker to this pawn on g5, maybe you'll be able to capture and go after the queen, but now Hartwell just plays g4, attacking Bobby's queen on f3, and these two pass pawns are looking more and more dangerous, each passing move. So queen to d5 by Bobby, lining up with his light squared bishop, centralizing the queen on a nice square, but now bishop to a1 by Hartwell. Looks like a weird move, but what you're threatening here, if Bobby ignores this move, then you just get queen to b2 with checkmate. The bishop is protecting the queen, and this is game over. So here Bobby has to play instead bishop to c1, and now this dark squared bishop is all it's doing is defending this b2 square from checkmate. And here Hartwell offers up a queen trade. This is a nice move, queen to d4. Obviously offering up a queen trade, but also attacking the rook on g1, which is undefended. Bobby does not want to trade queens. He's down material. He can't afford to trade down into an endgame, so he plays queen to h1, which also defends his rook on g1. We have a5 by Hartwell, hoping maybe to get this bishop off of b3, or even maybe rook to b8, and then the bishop will be pinned and the pawn can attack the bishop on b3. And now rook to d1 by Bobby, attacking this queen. Not really much for Bobby to do in this position, so sort of just moving the pieces around, hoping against hope that sort of something will come out of this position. The queen retreats to f6, and now a nice rook lift to d6, attacking the queen. And this looks like a strange rook sacrifice. The queen can capture back, which Hartwell does, but Bobby now is able to capture the bishop on a1 because there's no queen on this diagonal protecting the bishop. So that was sort of Bobby's decision, is trade the rook for this very strong bishop and this very useful pawn, and kind of a reasonable trade, especially because the rook wasn't doing much. But now if you look at the material, each side has 3 pawns, but Hartwell has 2 rooks, and Bobby has 2 bishops, so just a massive material advantage here for Hartwell, and this is essentially game over. But it's not really game over because Bobby keeps playing, and we'll sort of see what happens from here. So here, king to h7, getting in front of this, not allowing this pawn to advance anymore in the h-file. Queen to g2 here by Bobby, just sort of trying to find some counterplay. And now finally a4, attacking this light squared bishop, and obviously not many squares for this bishop to retreat to. Here the bishop moves to d5, and this was sort of, this was sort of the idea of keeping this queen on this diagonal to allow the bishop to come to d5, protected by Bobby's queen, but now just a3, and now you can sort of see this potential idea of the queen and the pawn teaming up on b2 to deliver some sort of finishing checkmate. So bishop retreats back to b3. There's no more threat of the pawn because obviously the pawn has advanced too far, so the bishop can now just hang out here on b3. But now we get rook to b8 by Ted, eyeing this this rook now on the b file, and now queen to f2 by Bobby, hoping maybe for some counterplay here. And here Ted plays the move rook to b4, with the idea potentially of doubling up on the b file with the rooks. And I know we've been like going over every move and sort of seeing how, Ted has these two passed pawns and has this material advantage and everything. But what if I told you that the move that Ted just made completely lost the game, and the game is actually now over in Bobby's favor, and the entire momentum has shifted? You might not believe me, but take a second and see if you can find the move that Bobby played that ends the game basically instantly. Well, I'll give you a couple of seconds. Okay, so it doesn't look like much happened, but in fact, like I said, there's just mate in a couple of moves here, and the game ended after Bobby played queen to a7 check. And I think this is probably the idea behind Bobby playing this queen to f2 move. In case Hartwell blunders here, which Hartwell unfortunately does, now you can bring the queen to a7. Before, the queen was on g2, so you wouldn't be able to bring the queen to b7 because the rook's guarding the entire b file. But now you have this queen to a7 check, and this doesn't look like a big deal, this check, but it is, and we'll see why. You can't block with any pieces, right? If the rook comes to b7, the queen just takes it, and you'd have the same old check. The black queen can block on 3 different squares, but none of these squares are protected by the rooks. So again, if the queen blocks anywhere, queen takes queen, and it's check all over again. And the same exact thing for the rook on f8. Queen takes rook, and it's still check. So these 3 pieces are guarding 3 squares on the 7th rank, but none of them are guarding the same square, so you have no effective block here, which is pretty crazy. But you might be saying, okay, you can't block, but certainly the king can escape, right? Well, the king only has 2 squares to go to, because don't forget about this bishop eyeing this g8 square. The king can't move to g8. Of course, if the king moves to h8, then queen to g7 is checkmate. That looks simple. The pawn is guarding the queen. But what about this king to g6 move? Well, then it's actually still just checkmate in a couple of moves, because again, you get queen to g7 with check. The king can't move to any of these squares, and has to move to h5. And then it looks like this is okay for Hartwell. It looks like you can escape here, but now queen to g5 is checkmate. It's not because the pawn is protecting. Of course, the pawn is protecting this way. It's because don't forget about this bishop on c1, protecting the queen, delivering checkmate to the king. So at the end of the day, this bishop preventing the king from escaping to g8, and this bishop preventing or allowing the queen to come to g5 with check were more powerful and more important than these 2 rooks, and just an incredible turnaround for Bobby Fischer. I mean, out of absolutely nowhere, and doesn't even look like a big blunder at all. But once the rook moves away, once essentially Hartwell doesn't deal with this threat, it's game over, and in this position he resigned. Kind of a bummer, you have such a lead against Bobby Fischer, and you blow it in the end game, but he played a great game, of course, and kudos to him, and a good example why you never want to resign. You always want to fight, because you never know when an opportunity like this will come up. The proper move in this position is just playing rook to b7. Now, of course, there is no queen to a7. The rook would just take it, so guarding the 7th rank here. And then here, the engine says Bobby should play king to b2, and now g3, and after just a couple of moves, you can sort of see there will be a forced queen trade, and now you have 2 rooks on the b file, a passed pawn that's 2 moves away from promoting, and this is just a totally good position for Hartwell. Unfortunately, it didn't come to that, of course, and we are left with this incredible last-minute comeback. Last-minute comeback here by Bobby with queen to a7. So hope you enjoyed that crazy up and down game. Thanks for watching. Drop a like, drop subscribe. Let me know of the other games you'd like me to review, and we'll see you next time.